Hi, my name is Eric Hibbard, and today I'm going to talk about internationalizing zero trust security. And in this talk, I'm going to wear one of many hats, but today I'm going to talk from the perspective of the IEEE Computer Society and some of its activities. But really, the intention of this talk is to give you insights into what's going on from an international perspective on this topic. So as a starting point, and this is for participants in this summit, this is probably old news, but just to sort of recap, and where we historically, from a security perspective, have been using a perimeter security model that many organizations and governments have used. And basically, it assumes an inside versus outside kind of perspective, where if you're on the inside, implicit, you are trusted at some level. If you're on the outside, you are untrusted and to be prevented from gaining access. Unless, of course, maybe you're on the outside, but should be on the inside, and then we end up using technologies like virtual private networks or VPNs and things of that nature, which complicate that barrier. So speaking of barriers, that is one of the core assumptions, is that you're able to put up protections that separate inside from outside. That isn't always a good assumption, and we use a variety of techniques and technologies, like, for example, firewalls, which in many cases are a little more than speed bumps for attackers. And as part of this model, there's often a set of resources that are in a special demilitarized zone or DMZ. And those are things like web servers and mail servers and an assortment of other technologies. So it's kind of a halfway house for the outsiders to gain access to certain resources, and then also for insiders who are on the outside able to sort of get into resources that need from, for example, for remote work. Okay, so that's what's been underway for quite some time. And what we're seeing now is a lot of interest in a zero trust security model, which is basically a whole new paradigm for how you go about protecting yourselves, you as an enterprise. Now, this concept of zero trust, it's not new. It's been around for quite a while. Even the Cloud Security Alliance has had a well-defined activity. And if you go and look at the Software Defined Perimeter, that's actually an implementation of how to approach zero trust, right? And I would say easily 20 years worth of activity in this space. A lot of it has been in the US government and not so much out in the enterprise space. With zero trust, there's assumption that, attackers are basically in the environment. It's a hostile environment. It's at your door. There's no perimeter. There's no hard shell to guard. So you basically have to be prepared to have the wolf at the door, so to speak. It assumes that enterprise-owned environments are basically the same as your competitors, your suppliers, or the internet in general. There is no difference between them, and there is no implicit trust. So there's no inside user versus outside user. Everybody is basically untrusted to some degree until, that trust is basically established. Okay, so, it's been around for a while. What's the big deal? Well, it actually is a big deal. And NIST really raised general awareness with publication of the zero trust architecture in the 800-207. Up until that point, we'd seen a variety of industry groups who've been talking about this, and the Cloud Security Alliance has been very vocal in this space. But this was the first time we've really seen an organization that operates in the standard space. In this case, U.S. standards. All right. So with that publication, not long after, what we saw in the Biden administration is issuing Executive Order 14028, which is approving cybersecurity. And sometimes it's referred to as the Cybersecurity Executive Order. And basically what was required here is that civilian agencies need to figure out how they're going to adopt a zero trust architecture. That architecture I just mentioned from NIST. And they need to basically deal with the principles and adjust their network architectures accordingly. So as you can see, the network is definitely an early focus from the Biden administration perspective. Well, they weren't the only ones, getting involved. And what you see is the Office of Management and Budget. This is the organization that basically spends money on behalf of the U.S. government. Money talks, right? So they've issued a zero trust strategy document that's in response to the executive order. And probably the noteworthy item here is federal agencies are required to basically have specific zero trust goals by the end of fiscal year 2024. For those of you who aren't familiar with the U.S. government, that means October of 2024 is the start of fiscal year 2025. So it's not that far off. We're talking, 9 months, 10 months that the agencies have something to do yet. All right. So CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has also gotten involved with zero trust, and they've developed the zero trust maturity model. And this model basically includes 5 pillars and 3 cross-cutting capabilities. And it's based on, again, the foundations of zero trust, hailing back to essentially what NIST has done in 800-207. Now, I mentioned the 5 pillars because these are the focus areas at a very, very high level that are being identified. And you'll see in a minute that different activities have different focus areas, and that could present some challenges down the road. The zero trust maturity model definitely complements the OMB's zero trust strategy. So in theory, with the combination of what NIST has done and what OMB has said and the CISA activity, if you're a federal agency, you're marching down a pretty solid path, right? And this maturity model also helps identify CISA services that can basically support from an agency level perspective, what you might need from, in terms of solutions and services and whatnot. Version 2 of the trust model is basically out. It came out earlier this year in the April timeframe. But you'll note that this is all U.S. government oriented. But it has some teeth behind it because, our friends in the General Services Administration, again, this is, part of the organization, the federal government that has some purchasing power. And you see that they've actually put out a buyer's guide on zero trust architecture. So if you are a vendor, most likely you are going to want to be on that list. So that the various agencies, mainly civilian agencies, will purchase your products. So, the power of the purse is quite a motivation. And what we're seeing from the current administration and the various agencies moving forward, that's definitely being brought to bear. And that's good news. And if you're a zero trust architect or advocate, because it's moved from, this is an interesting concept, to, hey, there's money to be made here. There's defenses to be put in place, but it is a paradigm shift. And so these motivations are really necessary to get organizations to sort of step up. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier, CISA has 5 pillars. Here's an example of the GSA's pillars, and they are slightly different. There's more. And this is a classic example of a technology area you start working, and there's lots of excellent ideas, but maybe not the convergence that's needed ultimately. And this is where the role of standards come into play at some point. And so what we're seeing right now is even within the U.S. government, there are variations in how to approach this zero trust architecture. All right, and I'm just highlighting that fact because when we move to what's going on, we see the U.S. government is definitely on top of this. They're moving forward aggressively. They got a timeline they have to deal with. Unfortunately, there are a bunch of different approaches, in particular if you focus on the pillars. We got lots of suppliers that are engaging, and some of them are actually, as we say, eating their own dog food. They're actually trying to see what it takes to do zero trust architecture in their own organizations. There are a bunch of international partners, like, for example, NATO, who, just because of their ongoing contact with different parts of the U.S. government, NIST and CSA and others, they naturally have a desire to have some level of alignment and basically to take advantage of the work that's already been done. But again, in the international arena, there are no specifications or standards that one can point at. And this becomes important when you start talking about things like the World Trade Organization and how standards relate to the WTO. And that's where the international activities are. There are also some countries that aren't necessarily fond of adopting US specific standards or specifications. And so if we're going to see something like zero trust be used in sort of the global security space, there's going to be a need for international standards. And I think we're at a point where that dialogue is really needed and is starting to take place. So let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing today from international standards development organizations, or SDOs, as we sometimes call them. So within ISO, there's a joint committee that with ISO and IEC. So a joint committee, technical committee 1, subcommittee 27, which deals with information security, cybersecurity, and privacy protections. So probably best known, this is where the 27,000 series standards are developed and maintained. So at this point, there are no standards projects focused on zero trust in SE27, which would be sort of a logical home for something like that if it were occurring in ISO or IEC. We are seeing many of the, if you look at specific security issues and technologies, whether it's supply chain or authentication, authorization, identity management, those kinds of things are very well covered by existing standards in SE27. But they haven't been brought to bear sort of leveraging a zero trust architecture. So remember, this is a paradigm shift. And as an example, the 27033 series standards, which is dealing with network security, which in the context of the ISO 27000 series is one of the core documents dealing with securing networks, right? There's no consideration at all beyond perimeter security. So zero trust is just not there. Now, I'm going to pick on that a little more, but what we are seeing is in some of the standards that have been recently published, as in the last couple of years, And keep in mind, it takes about 3 years to develop an ISO standard. So we're starting to see some standards that have mentions of zero trust in them. It's more of just an acknowledgement of it. There's very little commentary beyond just a simple mention. And maybe the exception that we're seeing right now is the 7-part 27033 series is being reviewed for possible revision. And so some of the initial information that's come in is that, yep, this series definitely needs to be retooled. And as part of that retooling, the role of zero trust really does need to be figured out and established. So that's sort of very, very recent input. I would say that in terms of taking action on such suggestions, you probably won't see anything until maybe sometime after April of next year, after the next SE27 meeting. They'll basically decide whether they're going to proceed with the revision. On the ITUT side, Study Group 17, which deals with security, actually has a project on the books. It's a technical report on guidelines for zero trust-based access control platforms and telecommunication networks. If you're familiar with how ITUT works, this is under question 2 for Study Group 17. And it actually is under development. So in terms of drafts, not a whole lot that's readily available at the moment. The ITU did hold a workshop on zero trust and software supply chain back in August of this year, and that was hosted in China. And Study Group 17 is now looking at collaborating with CISA on the zero trust maturity model. And again, it's looking at it from a standpoint of sort of the networking arena. But that, again, that is a recent development, for SG17, and not really brought that to a point where, there's any sort of tangible work that can be sampled, if you will. All right. Another activity in the international space is the IEEE Computer Society, and it's actually started some work in zero trust. So in June of 2020, it actually established the Zero Trust Security Working Group, and that sits underneath the Cybersecurity and Privacy Standards Committee, which is the organization that I chair, and part of the reason I'm talking to you about this today. So this working group is not focused on just a single project. It's basically the focus point for zero trust security in computer society. And its charter is to develop standards, guidelines, and guides, put together educational materials, and if appropriate, deal with conferences and meetings. Some of those could be outreach. They could, in fact, host full conferences if such was desired. But in many cases right now, there's enough industry activities underway. I don't foresee that happening anytime soon. That is, conferences. Meetings are happening on a regular basis. The chair of this activity is Thomas Rivera, and his email address is here. So if later you have an interest in joining this, Thomas is the right person to contact. This is an individual based membership working group. So what does that mean on your planet? Well, unlike ISO, which requires national body or liaison participation, so you don't just casually walk into the meetings to participate. You've got to be part of an established entity. And on the ITUT side, they have a similar structure where national bodies are basically engaging, but large enterprises also have the ability to engage as well. But you've got to be one of those those entities to be able to participate. With IEEE individual membership, experts from anywhere in the international community can join. There are basically no fees unless you're one of the officers of the working group. And so that makes it pretty easy to basically engage in some fashion. And I point that out because many of the standards organizations have fairly rigid structures, that you have to basically figure out how to navigate. That's not necessarily the case here. This working group has 2 approved projects, and I'll talk a little more about those in a minute, that are underway. And an important attribute that for IEEE Computer Society is it has an established liaison with Subcommittee 27. This is on the ISO side. And there's a full intention of taking the 2 projects that are being developed into SC27, and assuming they accept them, then they would end up as ISO, IEC, IEEE branded standards. So, the anticipation is that there'll be engagement from the international community, potentially experts from Subcommittee 27, as well as elsewhere. So a little bit about the projects. So P2887 is the first project, and it was established as a recommendation, which is basically a guidance document. And that means, for the most part, it'll have a should statements in it as opposed to shall. In other words, you're not going to basically claim conformance. Well, you could, but it won't necessarily, have any serious meaning. And it had a pretty broad scope to be able to, look at the existing architectures and develop terminology. And again, because the intention to address some ISO issues, the terminology is not verbose. It's very carefully crafted. And so that's part of what's going on. Trying to understand the core elements. You heard the term pillar earlier used. That's essentially, what's there. And in fact, figuring out what those core elements are is basically where both of these projects are right now. Is what are we going to focus on as sort of the mandatory pieces, if you will, of a not an architecture, but you'll see the other documents on a framework. And then there's specific guides. Now, this was the first project. You see that the current project authorization request. So the schedule is to basically have this wrapped up by the end of next year, which timing-wise aligns with some of what we saw with OMB and GSA intentions. All right, the newest project is P3409. This was just approved. And this document is focused on the framework. So this is actually a foundational document. We expect that the 2887 will, in fact, leverage this. Some of the early work done under the heading of 2887 is likely to fill content in this document. So some of the terminology, the materials that are focused on the existing architectures and whatnot will most likely be an annex or an appendix in this document. And this is the document that's going to identify, so what are from an IEEE Computer Society perspective, what are the pillars or the core elements that need to be addressed from a security perspective. And I draw your attention to that because these documents are focused on the security aspect of it and not just generically what is zero trust. It's assuming that those are basically covered in things like the NIST 800-207, and this is essentially taking it to the next level. What should you have, or what do you need to have when you're dealing purely from a security perspective? So as I said, this is a foundational standard. Really is going to bridge the architecture materials and We anticipate that the ISO side of the world will be able to, and potentially ITU-T would be able to take advantage of a document like this. Maybe 2887 guidance, but it's also possible that some of these other entities will have their own guidance standards or their own requirement standards. And this is really, a core element is what's the minimal and optional zero trust security elements that need to be in place. Okay, so from a zero trust perspective, and international, this looks like it's something here to stay. With the U.S. government putting some money where its mouth is, so to speak, that's really sort of upping the interest level, and this is not appearing to be yet another fad. This is looking like something that we're going to see organizations adopting. It is not a trivial transition from perimeter-based to zero trust, and during the summit, you most likely will get a taste of that in other sessions. I'll leave that to them to go into. And there are already other documents. The Cloud Security Alliance has numerous publications and working on additional ones that kind of help with how do you deal with that. I would say from my perch, and I do a lot of work in the international space, we are definitely seeing the standards development organizations are showing interest in the case of IEEE, already moving in a direction to help with some of the standardization, trying to make this more readily available from a standards perspective in the broader international community, while also, taking advantage of some of the work that's done in the U.S. and with some of the architectural pieces, so that early investments aren't going to encounter difficulties when you transition into the international space. And the IEEE Computer Society is here working on this, has been working on it for some time. This is a place where if you're an interested expert or your enterprise is involved in this and you want to get involved in the actual standards, you are welcome to join. As I said, there's very few requirements that are imposed on participation, but we are basically developing international standards with an intention to engaging the ISO IEC community at some point down the road. So with that, I will end. My contact details are here. You can reach me either with my IEEE address or my day job is with Samsung Electronics Incorporated in Silicon Valley, and my phone number here as well. And earlier in the presentation, I had the email address for the chair of the Zero Trust Security Working Group. And with that, I bid you a good day and hope to see you in the future in the IEEE activity.